The gun pressed against Eleanor Hayes's ribs wasn't supposed to be part of her wedding day. Neither was the telegram crumpled in her fist. Don't come. Changed my mind. Wedding canceled, or the jeering crowd of men circling her like wolves in the suffocating heat of a Montana saloon. Her white dress, once pristine, now bore the stains of betrayal and desperation. She'd traveled 2,000 miles to marry a man who didn't want her, and now she'd die in a town that didn't care. Until a quiet voice cut through the chaos. You don't belong here. A rancher stood in the doorway, two hollow-eyed boys clinging to his legs. Come with me. Stay until the end to see how a bride abandoned at a train station becomes the mother who saves an entire family from destruction. Like this video and comment what city you're watching from, so I can see how far this story has traveled. The summer sun beat down on Eleanor Hayes like a punishment she hadn't earned. It was July, high summer in Montana Territory, 1882, and the heat shimmered off the railroad tracks in waves that made the horizon look like water. Eleanor stood on the platform of Copper Ridge Station, her white wedding dress already darkened with sweat and the red dust that seemed to coat everything in this godforsaken place. She clutched the telegram in her hand so tightly the paper had gone damp. The words blurred, but she'd already memorized them. Stop. Wedding canceled. Do not proceed to Copper Ridge. Return east immediately. Callaway. 4 weeks of travel. 2,000 miles across an unforgiving country. Every penny she had left in the world spent on train fare and the dress she wore. And James Callaway, the man who'd courted her through letters filled with promises of a home, a partnership, a future, had decided she wasn't worth the trouble after all. Eleanor's legs trembled. She'd been standing on this platform for 3 hours, watching the train that brought her disappear back toward civilization, while the sun climbed higher and the few people who'd bothered to glance her way moved on with their business. A bride alone, abandoned, ridiculous in her wedding finery with nowhere to go and no money to leave. The station master, a grizzled man with tobacco-stained teeth, had stopped asking if she needed help. The last time he'd approached, he'd made it clear what kind of help men in this town offered women with no protection. Eleanor had locked herself in the ladies' waiting room until he left, but she couldn't hide there forever. The sun would set eventually, and Montana nights, she'd heard, could be as dangerous as the days were harsh. She needed a plan. She needed money. She needed... Pretty thing like you shouldn't be standing around alone. Eleanor's head snapped up. 3 men had materialized near the platform's edge, rough-looking cowboys with the kind of easy confidence that came from knowing no one would stop them from taking what they wanted. The one who'd spoken was young, maybe 25, with a scar cutting through his left eyebrow and a smile that made Eleanor's stomach turn. I'm waiting for someone, Eleanor lied, straightening her spine and forcing steel into her voice despite the panic rising in her throat. Yeah? The scarred man stepped closer. Who? My fiancée. That's so? Another man laughed, older and meaner looking. Funny thing, saw Jim Callaway head out to the Anderson Ranch this morning with another woman, real pretty blonde. Didn't look like he was expecting any bride from back east. The words hit Eleanor like a physical blow. Another woman. Of course. James hadn't just changed his mind. He'd found someone else, someone already here, someone more convenient. And he'd been too cowardly to even tell her before she'd traveled halfway across the continent. So, the scarred man said, his smile widening as he watched the realization cross Eleanor's face. Seems like you ain't got nobody waiting after all, which means you're free for the taking. He reached for her arm. Eleanor jerked backward, her heel catching on the hem of her dress. She stumbled, but didn't fall, her heart hammering so hard she could hear it in her ears. Don't touch me. Or what? The third man joined the others now, forming a loose half-circle that cut off her retreat. You gonna report us to the sheriff? He's my cousin, sweetheart, and he ain't particularly interested in the complaints of women who show up in wedding dresses for men who don't want 'em. Eleanor's mind raced. She could scream, but who would come? She could run, but where? The town of Copper Ridge spread out beyond the station, a collection of wooden buildings baking in the heat, saloons and supply stores and homes that all looked hostile and unwelcoming. She knew no one. She had nothing. She was completely, terrifyingly alone. "Leave me alone," she said again, but her voice shook this time, and they heard it. The scarred man lunged. Eleanor ran. She didn't think, didn't plan, just picked up her skirts and bolted off the platform toward the main street. Behind her, the men laughed and gave chase, their boots heavy on the sun-baked ground. Eleanor's lungs burned. The dress was too heavy, the corset too tight, the heat too oppressive. She'd never outrun them. She just needed to find somewhere public, somewhere with witnesses, somewhere. The saloon appeared ahead, its doors propped open to let in whatever breeze might exist. Eleanor could hear piano music and rough laughter spilling out into the street. She didn't hesitate. She ran straight through those doors into the dim, whiskey-soaked interior. Conversation stopped. Every head turned. Eleanor froze in the doorway, gasping for breath, her hair falling loose from its pins and her dress a disaster. 20, maybe 30 men stared at her, cowboys and ranchers and drifters, all of them holding cards or drinks or cigars, all of them looking at her like she was something between entertainment and prey. "Well, well," someone drawled. "What do we have here?" The scarred man and his friends appeared in the doorway behind her, blocking her escape. "Just a lost little bride," Scarface said loudly, to scattered laughter. "Looking for a husband since hers didn't want her." Eleanor's face burned with humiliation, but she forced herself to look around the room, searching desperately for someone, anyone who might help. But these were hard men in a hard town, and the amusement in their eyes told her everything she needed to know about what they thought of a desperate woman in a wedding dress. "I have money," Eleanor lied, her voice carrying across the sudden silence. "I can pay for a room. I just need—" "You don't have any money," the older cowboy from the station said, pushing past her into the saloon. "You spent it all getting here, didn't you? For a man who don't want you." He turned to address the room. "Jimmy Calloway sent for this one months ago, then changed his mind when Sarah Pritchard's daddy offered him 300 acres and a herd of cattle to marry his daughter instead. Left this one stranded at the station with nothing but that fancy dress." More laughter, cruel and knowing. Eleanor felt tears burning behind her eyes but refused to let them fall. She wouldn't cry, not here, not in front of these men who already saw her as worthless. "So what's a woman like that good for, boys?" Scarface asked, his hand closing around Eleanor's wrist before she could pull away. "Since she ain't gonna be a wife?" The room erupted in suggestions that made Eleanor's blood run cold. She tried to wrench her arm free, but his grip was iron. Someone else grabbed her other arm. Hands reached for her dress, her hair, pulling her deeper into the saloon while she struggled, and the piano player started up again like this was just another Tuesday afternoon's entertainment. "Let me go!" Eleanor finally screamed, abandoning dignity for survival. She kicked out, felt her foot connect with someone's shin, heard a curse. But there were too many of them, and she was one woman in a wedding dress that made her a target and a joke and a thing to be used. "That's enough." The voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the chaos like a knife through cloth. The hands on Eleanor stopped pulling. The laughter died down. Even the piano player's fingers faltered. Eleanor turned her head, gasping, and saw him. He stood in the saloon doorway, tall and broad-shouldered, with dark hair shot through with premature gray and eyes the color of storm clouds. His face was weathered by sun and wind, carved into hard lines that suggested a man who'd seen more trouble than most and survived it without softening. He wore simple rancher's clothes, dark trousers, a worn shirt, a leather vest, and carried himself with the kind of quiet authority that didn't need a weapon to back it up. Though he had one. A rifle hung loose in his right hand, not pointed at anyone, but present. Beside him, pressed against his legs like they were trying to disappear into his shadow, stood two identical boys. They couldn't have been more than 9 years old, thin and wary, with their father's dark hair and eyes that looked decades too old for their faces. They watched the scene in the saloon without expression, like violence and cruelty were things they'd learned to expect. "Jacob Reed," the bartender said, and his voice held a note of caution. "Didn't know you were in town." "Just finishing business," Jacob said. His gaze moved across the crowd and settled on Eleanor, still held between Scarface and his friend. Something flickered in those storm-gray eyes, recognition, maybe, or understanding. "Let her go." "Why?" Scarface's grip tightened on Eleanor's wrist hard enough to hurt. "She ain't yours. She ain't anybody's. Calloway didn't want her, and she's got nowhere else to go. That makes her fair game. It makes her desperate, Jacob said quietly. Not stupid. She came in here looking for help, not to be mauled by men who should know better. He paused. I said let her go. There was something in his voice now, not a threat exactly, but a promise. The kind of promise that suggested Jacob Reed didn't make statements he wasn't prepared to back up. Scarface hesitated, clearly weighing his options. Around the saloon, other men shifted uncomfortably. Eleanor got the sense that Jacob Reed wasn't someone you crossed lightly, even if you outnumbered him 20-1. She's trouble, the older cowboy muttered, but he released Eleanor's other arm. Woman shows up in a wedding dress for a wedding that ain't happening. That's bad luck, bad business. Then it's lucky she's leaving, Jacob said. His eyes found Eleanor's. You don't belong here. Come with me. Eleanor stared at him. It wasn't a request exactly, more like a statement of fact delivered in a tone that expected compliance. But there was something in his face, some flicker of genuine concern beneath all that weathered hardness, that made her want to trust him even though she'd just learned the hardest lesson of her life about trusting men she didn't know. I don't... Her voice came out hoarse. She swallowed and tried again. I don't know you. No, Jacob agreed. But you know them. He nodded toward Scarface and his friends. And you know what happens if you stay here without money or protection. So the question isn't whether you know me. It's whether you want to live through the night. Scarface laughed, harsh and ugly. Big talk, Reed, but you can't watch her forever, and this town's got a long memory for women who need teaching. Jacob's expression didn't change, but something dangerous flickered in his eyes. Touch her again, he said softly, and I'll make sure your memory gets real short real fast. The threat hung in the air like smoke. No one moved. Even the piano player had stopped completely now, watching the standoff with the rest of the room. Eleanor made her decision. She pulled her wrist free from Scarface's slackened grip and walked, straight-backed, head high, across the saloon floor toward Jacob Reed and his silent sons. Every eye followed her, every step felt like a mile. But she didn't look back, didn't let herself think about what she was doing or what might happen next. When she reached Jacob, he stepped aside to let her pass through the doorway into the blinding sunlight beyond. The boys moved with him like shadows, never quite meeting Eleanor's gaze but aware of her every movement. Thank you, Eleanor managed once they were outside, her voice shaking with reaction now that the immediate danger had passed. Jacob didn't respond. He was watching the saloon entrance, rifle still in hand, waiting to see if anyone would be stupid enough to follow. When no one did, he finally looked at her, really looked at her, taking in the ruined dress and loose hair and desperate eyes. What's your name? He asked. Eleanor Hayes. You really come here to marry Jim Calloway? She nodded, not trusting her voice. Jacob's expression hardened. Then you're lucky he changed his mind. Calloway's a coward and a drunk. You'd have been miserable. He paused. But that doesn't solve your current problem. Which is? You're stranded in a town full of men who think you're available with no money and no way out. His gaze was steady, assessing. How much of what you said in there was true? About having money? Eleanor's cheeks burned. None of it. I spent everything I had getting here. Family back east? No one who'd help. Jacob was quiet for a moment, and Eleanor braced herself for him to walk away. Why would he care about the problems of a stranger? He'd already done more than most would by getting her out of that saloon. She had no right to expect anything else. But then one of the boys, she couldn't tell which one, tugged on Jacob's sleeve. When Jacob looked down, the child whispered something Eleanor couldn't hear. Jacob's jaw tightened. He looked at Eleanor again, then at his sons, then back at Eleanor. Some kind of internal calculation was happening behind those storm cloud eyes, weighing risks and benefits and possibilities Eleanor couldn't begin to guess at. Finally, he spoke. I need someone to teach my boys. Someone patient and educated. Someone who won't... He trailed off, searching for words. Someone who'll stay. Eleanor blinked. You're offering me a job? A temporary position, Jacob corrected. 1 month. You teach Miles and Ethan to read and write properly, help around the house, earn your keep. In exchange, You get room and board and enough money at the end to buy a train ticket back east or wherever you want to go. It was too good to be true. Eleanor had learned that lesson already today. When things seemed too good, there was always a catch. Why? She asked bluntly. You don't know me. I could be a terrible teacher. I could rob you blind and disappear. Could be, Jacob agreed, but you won't. How do you know? For the first time, something that might have been the ghost of a smile flickered across his face. Because you went into that saloon looking for help instead of selling what they wanted to buy. Because you're still standing here arguing instead of just saying yes like someone desperate would. He paused. And because my boys haven't smiled in 3 years, and they're the ones who asked me to bring you. Eleanor looked down at the twins. They stared back, solemn and unreadable, but there was something in their eyes, a flicker of hope, maybe, or just curiosity, something that suggested they were as desperate for change as she was. 1 month, Eleanor repeated. 1 month, Jacob confirmed. Then you're free to go. No obligations, no strings, just teaching and honest work. Eleanor thought about the saloon behind her, about the men who'd chased her and the ones who'd laughed, about James Calloway and his convenient blonde bride and the 2,000 miles she'd traveled for a future that never existed. She thought about going back east with nothing to show for this disaster except humiliation and a ruined dress. Then she looked at Jacob Reed, this quiet, weathered rancher with his tragic, silent sons, and made her second impulsive decision of the day. All right, she said. 1 month. Jacob nodded once, sharp and final, like they'd just concluded a business deal, which, Eleanor supposed, they had. My wagon's at the livery. We'll leave within the hour. He turned and started walking, the boys falling into step beside him automatically. Eleanor hesitated only a moment before following, her wedding dress dragging in the dust of a Montana street, while the July sun beat down, and somewhere behind her, she heard the saloon doors swing shut on a life she'd never have. The wagon ride took them away from Copper Ridge and into country so vast, Eleanor couldn't quite believe it was real. Back east, the world had been close and crowded, cities pressing against farmland, roads carved through forests, civilization always visible on the horizon. Here, the land rolled on forever under an endless sky, grass rippling in waves that looked almost like water, interrupted only occasionally by clusters of cottonwood trees or the dark line of a creek bed. The heat was oppressive. Eleanor had never felt anything like it, this dry, relentless pressure that seemed to leach the moisture from her skin and make every breath feel like work. Sweat soaked through her dress and made her scalp itch beneath the ruins of her careful updo. She'd given up on maintaining any kind of dignity miles ago and had simply twisted her hair into a rough braid to get it off her neck. Jacob drove in silence, his hands steady on the reins while the horses pulled them over rough terrain that barely qualified as a road. The boys sat in the back of the wagon, watching Eleanor with the same wary intensity they'd shown since the moment she'd followed their father out of that saloon. She'd tried smiling at them. They hadn't smiled back. "How far is your ranch?" Eleanor asked, after what felt like an hour of nothing but wagon wheels and cicadas. 20 miles from town, Jacob said without looking at her. Another hour yet. 20 miles. Eleanor tried to imagine what that meant for supplies, for help, for escape if things went wrong. Back east, 20 miles was nothing, a train ride, a day's journey at most. Here, it felt like the distance between civilization and wilderness. "Do you go into town often?" she asked. "Once a month for supplies. Less if I can manage it." Eleanor absorbed this. Once a month. She'd be living on an isolated ranch with a man she didn't know and 2 children who looked at her like she might disappear at any moment. The smart thing would be to demand he turn the wagon around, take her back to Copper Ridge, let her figure out some other way to survive. But the smart thing would also have been not getting on a train to marry a stranger in the first place. "The boys," Eleanor tried again. "Miles and Ethan, how old are they?" 9. "They're twins?" "Yes." "Do they always—" Eleanor searched for a diplomatic way to phrase it. "Are they always so quiet?" Jacob's hands tightened on the reins, just barely, but Eleanor saw it. "They talk when they have something to say." It was a clear signal to stop asking questions. Eleanor fell silent,
watching the landscape roll past and wondering what kind of tragedy could steal the voices from two 9-year-old boys. The sun had started its slow descent toward the horizon when the ranch finally appeared.
It wasn't what Eleanor had expected, not the rough temporary structures she'd imagined, but a proper homestead carved out of the wild country with clear evidence of years of hard work. A 2-story house stood at the center, weathered but solid, with a wide porch that wrapped around the front. Behind it, she could see a barn, a chicken coop, a corral with several horses, and various outbuildings she couldn't identify. A creek ran along the southern edge of the property, lined with cottonwoods that provided the first real shade Eleanor had seen in hours. The grass here was greener, taller, waving in a breeze that smelled like water and sage, and something else she couldn't name, something that felt almost like possibility. "It's beautiful," Eleanor said before she could stop herself. Jacob glanced at her, surprise flickering across his face. "It's isolated." "That too." Eleanor watched as they drew closer, taking in details. The neat fence lines, the vegetable garden struggling against the summer heat, the way everything suggested careful maintenance despite obvious hardship. "How long have you been here?" 12 years. Built most of it myself." He brought the wagon to a halt in front of the house. "Boys were born here. Their mother—" He stopped abruptly, his jaw working like he was chewing on words he couldn't quite spit out. "She died 3 years ago." So there it was. The tragedy Eleanor had been circling around with her questions. A dead mother and 2 boys who'd stopped smiling. She wanted to ask how. Illness, accident, childbirth. But the look on Jacob's face made it clear that conversation was over before it began. "I'm sorry," Eleanor said quietly. Jacob didn't respond. He just climbed down from the wagon and reached up to help her, a gesture so automatic and unexpected that Eleanor almost fumbled it. His hand was rough with calluses, strong, and he set her on the ground like she weighed nothing. The boys had already scrambled out of the back and stood waiting by the porch steps, watching, always watching. "I'll show you where you'll sleep," Jacob said. "Then we'll go over the rules." "Rules?" "You're working here, not visiting. That means expectations." He was already walking toward the house, clearly expecting her to follow. "You'll have your own room. Used to be the sewing room before." He cleared his throat. "Before. Boys sleep upstairs, I'm downstairs. You don't go into my room, I don't go into yours." "Of course," Eleanor said, slightly offended that he felt the need to specify. "You'll teach the boys every morning, reading, writing, arithmetic, whatever else you know. Afternoons, you help with the house and meals. We all eat together. We all pull our weight, no exceptions." They'd reached the porch now. Up close, Eleanor could see the wear on the house more clearly. Paint peeling in places, a loose board that creaked under Jacob's boot, windows that could use a good washing. But it was still more solid than anything she'd expected, and when Jacob pushed open the front door and she stepped inside, she found herself in a home that, while sparse, showed signs of having once been truly lived in. There was a large main room with a stone fireplace, a sturdy table surrounded by mismatched chairs, shelves holding books and tools and various necessities. Doors led off to what she assumed were bedrooms. The floor was wood, clean but scarred. The walls were bare except for a single photograph hanging above the fireplace, a woman with dark hair and a genuine smile, holding 2 infant boys. Eleanor didn't need to ask who she was. "Your room," Jacob said, gesturing to a door on the right. "I'll bring your bag." "I don't have a bag," Eleanor admitted. "Just what I'm wearing." Jacob stopped and looked at her, really looked at her for the first time since they'd left town, taking in the ruined wedding dress and the fact that she literally had nothing else in the world. "Sarah, my late wife. She kept some things. In the trunk in your room. You can use what fits." He said it roughly, like the offer cost him something. "Tomorrow, we'll get you proper work clothes." Eleanor felt tears prickling again, but this time from gratitude rather than despair. "Thank you." Jacob nodded stiffly and turned away. "Boys, show Miss Hayes where we keep the wash basin and towels. I expect she'll want to clean up before supper." The twins moved as one, silent and efficient, gesturing for Eleanor to follow them. She did, leaving Jacob standing alone in that room with the photograph of his dead wife and the stranger he'd just brought into his home. Her room was small but clean. A narrow bed, a dresser, a window looking out over the creek, and the promised trunk at the foot of the bed. The boys pointed to the wash basin on the dresser, then to a stack of towels on a shelf, then to a pitcher of water they must have filled earlier. They did all of this without speaking a single word. "Thank you," Eleanor said gently. "Miles and Ethan, right? Which one of you is which?" They looked at each other. Some silent communication passed between them. Then the boy on the left pointed to himself. "Miles?" Eleanor guessed. He nodded. "And you're Ethan," she said to the other boy. Another nod. They were identical, same dark hair, same gray eyes, same wary expressions. But now that Eleanor looked closer, she could see small differences. Miles had a tiny scar above his right eyebrow. Ethan stood slightly taller, though that might have just been posture. "I'm Eleanor," she said. "Miss Hayes, I suppose, if we're being formal. But Eleanor's fine if you prefer." They stared at her. Eleanor resisted the urge to fidget under that doubled gaze. "Your father said you haven't smiled in 3 years," she said quietly. "I don't know what happened to make you stop, but I want you to know I'm not here to replace your mother. I couldn't even if I tried. I'm just here to teach you for a month, and maybe—" She paused, choosing her words carefully. "Maybe we can help each other. I don't know how to live on a ranch, and you don't know how to trust a stranger, but we've got a month to figure it out together." The boys exchanged another look. Then, without warning, they both turned and fled from the room, their footsteps thundering up the stairs to whatever sanctuary they'd claimed on the second floor. Eleanor sighed and looked at her reflection in the small mirror above the dresser. She barely recognized herself. Hair wild, face sunburned, eyes shadowed with exhaustion and shock. The wedding dress that had represented all her foolish hopes this morning now looked like something from a nightmare. She peeled it off with shaking hands and stuffed it into the bottom of the trunk, covering it with whatever dresses she found folded there. Sarah Reed's dresses. A dead woman's clothes for a living woman with no other options. Eleanor tried not to think too hard about the symbolism as she washed away the day's sweat and dust and redressed in a simple blue cotton dress that was slightly too short but otherwise fit well enough. By the time she emerged from her room, the sun had dropped lower and the house had filled with the smell of something cooking. Eleanor followed the scent to a kitchen she hadn't noticed earlier. A practical space with a wood stove, a dry sink, and shelves holding more supplies than she'd expected to see this far from town. Jacob stood at the stove, stirring something in a large pot. He'd removed his vest and rolled up his sleeves, and Eleanor was struck by how domestic the scene would have seemed if not for the rifle still propped against the wall within easy reach. "I can cook," Eleanor offered. "If you'd rather—" "I've got it tonight," Jacob said without turning around. "Tomorrow you can take over. Boys like things simple. Stew, bread, nothing fancy." "I can manage that." "Good." He ladled stew into 4 bowls and set them on the table. "Boys, supper." The thundering footsteps came again, and Miles and Ethan appeared at the kitchen doorway. They'd washed up, Eleanor noticed, faces clean, hair damp. They slid into chairs on one side of the table and waited, hands in their laps, eyes down. Jacob sat at the head of the table. After a moment's hesitation, Eleanor took the remaining seat, the one that must have been Sarah's, facing the kitchen, close enough to the stove to serve, but far enough from Jacob to maintain that careful distance he seemed to require. They ate in silence. The stew was surprisingly good, beef and vegetables and some herb Eleanor couldn't identify, but that gave everything a pleasant, earthy flavor. She was hungrier than she'd realized, and it took effort not to simply shovel the food in like she hadn't eaten in days. "Tomorrow," Jacob said eventually, his voice startling in the quiet, "you'll start teaching after breakfast. I'll show you where the books are. Boys already know their letters and numbers. Their mother taught them that much. But they need more. History, geography, proper grammar, whatever you can give them." "I'll do my best," Eleanor said. "I was a teacher back in Boston, for 2 years before—" She trailed off, not wanting to explain the circumstances that had led her to accept James Calloway's proposal in the first place. Jacob didn't push. "Then you know what you're doing. That's good." He glanced at his sons. "And they're smart boys. They'll learn if you give them reason to." It was the first almost compliment Eleanor had heard him give, and from the way Miles and Ethan sat up slightly straighter, it might have been the first they'd heard in a while, too. After supper, Jacob disappeared to deal with some evening chores while Eleanor washed the dishes with the boys' silent, efficient help. They knew exactly where everything belonged, working around her in a coordinated dance that suggested years of practice. When Eleanor tried to put a pot on the wrong shelf, Ethan gently redirected her hand without speaking. By the time everything was clean and put away, full darkness had fallen outside the windows. Eleanor could hear crickets and the distant sound of the creek, and nothing else. No city noise, no neighbors, no sign of human life beyond this small circle of light in the vast Montana night. Jacob reappeared and sent the boys upstairs to bed. They went without argument, though Eleanor saw them pause at the top of the stairs to look back at her, like they were checking to make sure she was still there. "They'll test you," Jacob said once the boys were out of earshot. "See if you'll stay or run like—" He stopped himself. "They'll test you. Don't take it personal." "I won't," Eleanor promised, though she wasn't sure she believed it. Jacob studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable in the lamplight. "You did a brave thing today. Stupid, maybe, trusting a stranger. But brave. I didn't have much choice. There's always a choice. You could have stayed in that saloon, taken what they offered. Some women do." His tone was neutral, but there was something in his eyes. Respect, maybe, or just acknowledgement. "But you chose different. That tells me something about who you are." Eleanor felt heat rise in her cheeks. "It tells you I'm desperate." "It tells me you've got spine," Jacob corrected. "And that's what my boys need right now. Someone with spine enough to stay when things get hard." He turned toward his own bedroom door, then paused. "1 month, Miss Hayes. Prove you can do this, and maybe we'll talk about making it longer." "I thought you said 1 month. No obligations." "I did. But things change." He looked back at her, and for just a second Eleanor saw something raw in his expression. Grief, loneliness, a desperate hope he was trying hard not to show. "They liked you, asked me to bring you. That's the first thing they've asked for since their mother died." Before Eleanor could respond, he disappeared into his room and closed the door, leaving her alone in the main room with the dying fire and the photograph of Sarah Reed and the weight of 2 broken boys' fragile hope settling onto her shoulders like a yoke she wasn't sure she was strong enough to carry. But she'd try. Because Jacob was right. She did have spine. And because somewhere in the last 12 hours, between the telegram and the train station and the saloon and this impossible ranch in the middle of nowhere, Eleanor Hayes had stopped running from the life she'd lost and started fighting for the life she might still build. Even if she only had 1 month to figure out how, Eleanor woke to darkness and the sound of screaming. She bolted upright in the unfamiliar bed, heart hammering, momentarily lost in the confusion of not knowing where she was. Then it came back. The ranch, Jacob Reed, the boys, and the screaming resolved itself into a child's voice, high and terrified, coming from somewhere above her head. She was out of bed and through her door before conscious thought caught up with her body. The main room was black except for moonlight filtering through the windows, but she could see well enough to navigate to the stairs. Above, she heard Jacob's voice, low and urgent, and the continued sound of crying. Eleanor climbed the stairs quickly, her borrowed nightgown tangling around her legs. The second floor was a single large room that had been divided by curtains into sleeping areas, one side for the boys, one side apparently for storage. A lamp had been lit, throwing wavering shadows across the walls. Jacob knelt beside one of the narrow beds, his hands on his son's shoulders. "Ethan." Eleanor thought it was Ethan, though in the lamplight and chaos she couldn't be sure, thrashed against his father's hold, eyes wide and unseeing, still caught in whatever nightmare had seized him. Miles sat in the other bed, knees pulled to his chest, watching his brother with an expression of such weary familiarity that it broke Eleanor's heart. "It's all right," Jacob was saying, his voice steady despite the strength it must have taken to hold a 9-year-old in the grip of night terrors. "You're safe. You're home. It's all right." But it clearly wasn't all right. Ethan's screams had dissolved into harsh, gasping sobs, and even as Eleanor watched, she saw him try to claw away from Jacob's grip, fighting against the very comfort being offered. Eleanor moved forward without thinking. "Let me try." Jacob's head snapped up, and for a moment she saw anger flash across his face. How dare she presume? But then Ethan lurched particularly violently, and Jacob's grip slipped and Eleanor was already there, dropping to her knees beside the bed. "Ethan," she said quietly. Not loud enough to startle, but firm enough to cut through the panic. "Ethan, can you hear me? You're having a bad dream, sweetheart. Just a dream." The boy's eyes fixed on her face. He was still crying, still trembling, but some of the wild terror had faded from his expression. "That's right," Eleanor continued, keeping her voice low and even. "You're in your room. Your father's here, your brother's here, and I'm here too. You're safe. Nothing's going to hurt you." "The fire," Ethan choked out, the first words Eleanor had heard him speak. "The fire's coming." "There's no fire," Eleanor said gently. "Look around. No fire. Just us. Just your family." Ethan's gaze darted around the room as if expecting flames to appear, but gradually his breathing slowed. The rigid terror in his small body began to ease, and when Eleanor carefully reached out and touched his hand, he didn't pull away. "My mama burned," Ethan whispered, and the words hung in the air like smoke. "She burned, and we couldn't help her, and now she's gone forever." Jacob made a sound, low and wounded, barely audible. Eleanor glanced at him and saw such raw pain on his face that she had to look away. "I'm so sorry that happened," Eleanor said to Ethan, still holding his hand. "That must have been terrifying, but you're safe now. The fire is over. It can't hurt you anymore." "But it comes back," Ethan said. "Every night it comes back and she's burning and I can't. His voice broke, and this time when Eleanor opened her arms, the boy collapsed into them, sobbing against her shoulder with the kind of desperate grief that suggested he'd been holding it in for far too long. Eleanor held him, one hand stroking his hair, murmuring the wordless comfort that needed no language, just presence, just steadiness, just the promise that he didn't have to face the nightmare alone. Over Ethan's shaking shoulders, Eleanor met Jacob's eyes. The rancher looked shattered, his usual stoic mask completely stripped away to reveal a father who'd been watching his son suffer and didn't know how to stop it. "How often?" Eleanor asked quietly. 3-4 times a week, Jacob said, his voice rough. Both of them, though Miles stopped screaming out loud after the first year. Now he gestured to the other bed where Miles still sat, silent and watchful. "He just stays quiet and waits for it to pass." Eleanor's chest tightened. She looked at Miles, who stared back with those two old eyes, and she understood suddenly why Jacob had brought her here, why he'd offered her this job with such quiet desperation. Because his sons were drowning in grief and trauma, and he didn't know how to save them. "Come here, Miles," Eleanor said softly, shifting to make room without releasing Ethan. "You shouldn't have to go through this alone either." Miles hesitated, glancing at his father. Jacob nodded, and after a moment Miles climbed out of his bed and crossed to Eleanor. He didn't collapse like his brother had, but when Eleanor wrapped her free arm around him, he leaned into her side with the careful, tentative trust of a child who'd learned that adults could disappear. They stayed like that for a long time. Eleanor on the floor beside Ethan's bed, both boys pressed against her while Jacob watched from a few feet away, looking lost in his own home. Gradually, Ethan's sobs quieted to hiccuping breaths, then to silence. His weight grew heavier as exhaustion pulled him back toward sleep. "Can you tell us a story?" Miles whispered. The first time Eleanor had heard his voice too, and it was startling how similar the twins sounded. "Mama used to tell us stories when we couldn't sleep." Eleanor's mind raced. She hadn't prepared for this, hadn't expected to become a source of comfort on her very first night, but she could feel both boys waiting and Jacob watching, and she knew that this moment mattered more than she could fully understand. "All right," she said, "let me think. Have you ever heard about the summer the stars fell into the creek?" Both boys shook their heads against her shoulders. "Well," Eleanor began, falling into the rhythm of storytelling the way she had with her students back in Boston. "There was once a ranch not so different from this one, with wide fields and a creek that ran clear and cold even in the hottest weather. And on this ranch lived 2 boys who were brave and clever and loved to explore." She wove a tale out of nothing, about brothers who found fallen stars in their creek and had to return them to the sky before the sun rose, about the adventures they had and the friends they made along the way.
It was silly and fantastical and completely improvised, but the boys listened with rapt attention, and by the time Eleanor reached the ending, the stars safely home, the boys celebrated as heroes. Both Miles and Ethan had relaxed completely against her. "Did the boys get to keep anything?" Ethan asked sleepily. "From the stars." "They did," Eleanor said. "The stars gave them each a gift, the ability to find light even in the darkest places, so that no matter how scary things got, they'd always know that morning would come again." Miles was quiet for a moment. Then, "That's a good gift." "It is," Eleanor agreed. She carefully shifted both boys back toward Ethan's bed. "Now, do you think you can sleep? I'll stay right here until you do." "Promise?" Ethan asked, his eyes already drooping. "I promise." Jacob moved to help tuck the boys in, his large hands surprisingly gentle as he pulled blankets up and smoothed hair back. Miles crawled into bed beside his brother, apparently a common occurrence, and they curled together the way only twins could, two halves of the same whole seeking comfort in proximity. Eleanor sat on the floor beside the bed, her back against the wall, and within minutes both boys had drifted off to sleep. Their breathing synchronized, deep and even, no longer hitching with sobs. Jacob remained standing, looking down at his sons with an expression Eleanor couldn't fully read. Finally he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "Thank you. I couldn't reach them. When the nightmares come, I can never—" He trailed off, his jaw working. "You were doing fine," Eleanor said quietly. "Sometimes children just need a different approach in the moment. It doesn't mean you failed them." "I fail them every day." The words came out harsh, self-condemning. "I can't give them what they need, can't make them smile, can't chase away the nightmares, can't bring back their mother." "No one can bring her back," Eleanor said. "And maybe that's not what they need. Maybe they just need to know they're allowed to heal, that it's all right to have nightmares and it's all right to be sad, but it's also all right to eventually be happy again." Jacob looked at her then, really looked at her, and Eleanor saw something shift in his expression. "You said you were a teacher in Boston. Why'd you leave?" Eleanor hadn't expected the question, and for a moment she considered deflecting, but something about the darkness and the intimacy of the moment, both of them keeping vigil over sleeping children, made honesty feel necessary. "My students' parents thought I was too modern in my methods," she said carefully. "Too willing to question traditional approaches, too—" She paused, searching for the right word. "Too much. I was dismissed, and I had no family to fall back on, no other prospects. When James Calloway's proposal came, it seemed like a chance to start over somewhere that might value independence instead of punishing it. Seems like you got something different than you bargained for." Eleanor almost laughed. "That's an understatement." "You could still leave," Jacob said. "When the month's up, go back east, find another teaching position somewhere that appreciates what you can do." "I could?" Eleanor agreed. She looked down at the sleeping boys, at the way they held on to each other, even in sleep. "Or I could stay. See if I can actually help." "They're already attached to you," Jacob warned. "If you leave after making them care, it'll hurt them worse than never having you at all." "Then I'll have to make sure I don't make promises I can't keep," Eleanor said. She met Jacob's gaze steadily. 1 month. That's what we agreed. I'll give you everything I have for that month, and at the end, we'll see where we stand." Jacob studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Fair enough." He moved toward the stairs. "I'll leave the lamp burning low in case they wake again. You should get some sleep, Miss Hayes. Morning comes early on a ranch." "Eleanor," she said, "if I'm going to be living here, you might as well call me Eleanor." He paused at the top of the stairs. "Jacob, then. Good night, Eleanor." "Good night." She listened to his footsteps descend, heard his bedroom door close, and then she was alone with the sleeping boys and the low lamplight and the weight of what she'd just promised. 1 month. 29 days left now. 29 days to figure out if she could actually help heal a family that had been broken by fire and loss. Eleanor closed her eyes and let herself doze, her back against the wall, close enough to the boys to hear if they stirred but far enough to give them space. She'd learned long ago to sleep lightly, to wake at the slightest sound, a skill developed from years of being responsible for herself with no safety net.
She would need all those skills now. Morning came with rooster crow and the gray light of pre-dawn. Eleanor woke stiff and sore from sleeping on the floor, but when she checked the boys, they were still sleeping peacefully, their faces relaxed in a way that made them look actually 9 years old instead of 90. She crept downstairs to find Jacob already up, coffee brewing on the stove and the smell of bacon filling the kitchen. He glanced at her as she entered, taking in her wrinkled nightgown and sleep-tangled hair, but didn't comment. "Coffee?" he offered. "Please." He poured her a cup, strong and black, and returned to the bacon. They worked in companionable silence, Jacob cooking while Eleanor set the table and tried to remember where everything was stored. By the time the boys appeared, drawn by the smell of breakfast, there were plates of bacon and eggs and fresh bread waiting. The boys looked better this morning, rested, calmer. They slid into their usual seats and ate with good appetite while Eleanor watched them covertly, trying to understand the children she'd be teaching. "After breakfast," Jacob said, "I'll show Eleanor where the books are kept, and you boys will start your lessons. I'll be working on the south fence line if you need me, but I expect you to mind Eleanor and do what she asks. Understood?" Both boys nodded. "And Eleanor," Jacob continued, turning to her, "the boys know their chores. They'll need to do them in the afternoon, feeding chickens, collecting eggs, helping with whatever needs doing. But mornings are for learning." "Understood," Eleanor said, mirroring the boys. The corner of Jacob's mouth twitched, not quite a smile, but close. "Good." After breakfast, Jacob led Eleanor to a small room off the main living area that she hadn't noticed the night before. It was barely more than a closet, really, but it held a small desk, 2 chairs, and several shelves of books that made Eleanor's heart sing with recognition. Literature, history, mathematics, geography, a better collection than she'd expected to find this far from civilization. "Sarah collected them," Jacob said, running his hand along one shelf with unconscious tenderness. "She believed education was the most important thing we could give the boys. She taught them every day until—" He stopped, cleared his throat. "Until she couldn't anymore. I've tried to keep it up, but I'm not a teacher. They need more than I can give them." Eleanor pulled out a geography text and flipped through it, noting the careful handwriting in the margins. Sarah's notes to herself about what to emphasize, what the boys enjoyed. It felt both intimate and sad, reading the thoughts of a woman who'd never expected to die so young. "I'll do my best to continue her work," Eleanor said quietly. Jacob nodded and left her there. A moment later, she heard the front door close and knew he'd gone out to face whatever work a ranch required. The boys appeared in the doorway, waiting. Eleanor smiled at them. "Well then, shall we begin?" The first days fell into a rhythm that felt both foreign and increasingly natural. Mornings meant lessons. Eleanor quickly discovered that Jacob hadn't exaggerated about his son's intelligence. They read well for their age, understood mathematical concepts with ease, and had absorbed more history and geography from their mother than many children twice their age knew. But there were gaps, places where Sarah's death had interrupted their education, and Eleanor set about filling them with patient determination. The boys were cautious with her at first, answering questions but offering nothing extra, completing assignments with mechanical precision but no enthusiasm. But gradually, as the days passed and Eleanor proved she wasn't going to disappear or hurt them or try to replace their mother, they began to thaw. It started with small things. Miles asking a question that wasn't part of the lesson, just curiosity. Ethan volunteering information about something he'd observed during afternoon chores. Both of them leaning closer when Eleanor read aloud from the adventure novels Sarah had collected, their eyes bright with interest they couldn't quite hide. Afternoons were for practical work, and this was where Eleanor struggled most. She'd never collected eggs from chickens that seemed personally offended by her presence. She'd never weeded a garden in heat that made her dizzy. She'd never learned to work a water pump or hang laundry or cook over a wood stove that required constant adjustment to maintain the right temperature. But the boys helped her, and slowly Eleanor began to understand the quiet language they'd developed. The way Miles would touch her elbow when she was about to make a mistake. The way Ethan would demonstrate a task without speaking, and then wait patiently while she tried it herself. They were teaching her just as much as she was teaching them, though neither party acknowledged it out loud. Jacob remained largely separate from their daily routine. He worked the ranch from dawn until well after dusk, appearing for meals and occasionally in the evenings to check on the boys, but otherwise keeping his distance. Eleanor understood it was deliberate. He was giving her space to establish her own relationship with his sons, not wanting to crowd or complicate things. But sometimes she'd look up from the garden or the laundry and find him watching from across the yard, his expression unreadable. And sometimes at dinner, when the boys were talking more freely than they had in years according to the subtle changes in Jacob's face, she'd catch him looking at her with something that might have been gratitude or might have been fear. 2 weeks into her stay, Eleanor woke again to screaming. This time it was Miles, and this time Eleanor knew what to do. She went upstairs, sat beside his bed, and told him another story, this one about 2 boys who tamed wild horses that could run faster than the wind. By the time she finished, both twins were calm and drowsy, and when she rose to leave, Ethan's small voice stopped her. "Will you stay again, until we fall asleep?" Eleanor had been planning to return to her own bed, exhausted from a day of hard work under the relentless sun, but she looked at their faces, hopeful and vulnerable in the lamplight, and found she couldn't refuse. "Of course," she said, and settled against the wall. She woke hours later to find someone had covered her with a blanket. Jacob stood at the top of the stairs, another blanket in his hands, clearly having just finished tucking her in. Their eyes met in the dim light. Neither spoke. Jacob simply nodded once, acknowledgement, maybe, or thanks, and disappeared back downstairs. Eleanor pulled the blanket closer and let herself drift off again, warmed by more than just wool. The 3rd week brought the first real test of Eleanor's resolve. She'd gone into town with Jacob to pick up supplies, leaving the boys at the ranch under strict instructions to stay close to the house. It was her first time back in Copper Ridge since the day she'd arrived, and she felt the eyes on her the moment they drove down the main street. "Ignore them," Jacob said quietly, handling the reins with steady hands. But ignoring them proved difficult when Scarface, whose name, Eleanor learned, was actually Tom Miller, blocked their path outside the general store. "Well, well," Tom said, his grin as unpleasant as Eleanor remembered. "If it isn't Reed's new housekeeper, how's that working out for you, sweetheart? Getting tired of playing mama to someone else's brats yet?" Eleanor felt anger flash through her, hot and sharp. She opened her mouth to respond, but Jacob was already moving. He handed her the reins and stepped down from the wagon with the kind of deliberate calm that somehow seemed more dangerous than rage. "You've got something to say to me, Tom?" Jacob asked, his voice quiet. Tom's grin faltered slightly. "Just making conversation, Reed. No need to get all protective. We all know she's just temporary anyway. Soon as she gets enough money, she'll be gone like smoke." "What Eleanor does is none of your concern," Jacob said. "And if I hear you've been bothering her or spreading talk about her, we're going to have a problem. The kind of problem that ends with you explaining to the sheriff why you can't stop harassing a woman who wants nothing to do with you." "Your sheriff's my cousin," Tom reminded him, but there was less confidence in his voice now. "And my ranch employs half the county during harvest season," Jacob replied. "People have long memories, Tom. You do well to remember that." He held Tom's gaze until the younger man looked away, then turned and walked into the general store like nothing had happened. Eleanor sat frozen on the wagon, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and something else, something warm that she didn't want to examine too closely. Inside the store, Jacob conducted business with his usual efficiency while Eleanor gathered supplies from a list he'd given her. The shopkeeper's wife, a pleasant woman named Martha, chatted with Eleanor about recipes and garden troubles, treating her like a normal customer instead of a scandal. It was such a relief after Tom's hostility that Eleanor found herself relaxing, even smiling. "It's good to see those boys have someone looking after them properly again," Martha said quietly as she wrapped Eleanor's purchases. "Jacob does his best, but a ranch that size and 2 grieving boys, it was too much for one man. I'm glad you're there." "It's only for a month," Eleanor said automatically. Martha gave her a knowing look. "That's what my sister said when she came out here to help her cousin with the children. She's been here 23 years now, married to the rancher next door, with 5 children of her own." She smiled. "Sometimes temporary has a way of becoming permanent, if you let it." Eleanor didn't know how to respond to that, so she simply thanked Martha and carried her packages out to the wagon. Jacob was already there, loading supplies into the back. He helped her up without comment, and they drove out of town in silence. They were halfway home when Jacob finally spoke. You handled Tom well. Keeping quiet, I mean. Some women would have made it worse by trying to argue with him. Eleanor felt a flash of irritation. I'm not some women, and I didn't keep quiet because I'm meek. I kept quiet because you were already handling it, and I didn't want to undermine you. Jacob glanced at her, surprise flickering across his face. I didn't mean— I know what you meant, Eleanor interrupted, and I appreciate you standing up for me. But don't mistake strategic silence for inability to defend myself. If you hadn't been there, I would have handled Tom just fine. Would you? Jacob's tone was mild, but there was genuine curiosity there. How? I spent 2 years teaching in a school where half the fathers thought women had no business educating children, and the other half thought I should be grateful for any attention they gave me, appropriate or not, Eleanor said. I learned to use words like weapons, Jacob. I learned exactly how to make a man feel small without giving him anything concrete to complain about. Tom Miller doesn't scare me. He's just another bully who thinks intimidation is the same as power. Jacob was quiet for a long moment. Then, I believe you, but all the same, I'm glad I was there. Something in his tone made Eleanor look at him. His hands were tight on the reins, his jaw set, and she realized he'd been more worried than he'd let on. Not worried that she couldn't handle herself, but worried about what might happen if Tom pushed too hard and crossed a line Jacob couldn't protect her from. The boys asked about you this morning, Jacob said, changing the subject. Wanted to know if you were coming back or if you'd decided to leave while you were in town. Eleanor's chest tightened. What did you tell them? That you'd be back, that you promised them a month, and you seemed like the type to keep your word. He paused. They've lost too many people, Eleanor. Their mother, and before that, there were others. Housekeepers who couldn't handle the isolation, who left without warning. The boys learned not to trust anyone who wasn't blood. But they're trusting me, Eleanor said quietly. Yes. Jacob met her eyes briefly before returning his attention to the road. So please, whatever you decide to do when the month is up, give them warning. Let them prepare. Don't just disappear. I won't, Eleanor promised. I would never do that to them. They completed the journey in silence, but it was a different quality of silence now. Comfortable, companionable. When they finally pulled up to the ranch, the boys came running from the house, and Eleanor felt something shift in her chest at the sight of their eager faces. She was getting attached. Despite all her warnings to herself, despite knowing this was temporary, she was falling in love with these broken boys and their careful, wounded father. And the truly terrifying part was that she no longer wanted to leave. That night, after another story and another peaceful sleep for the twins, Eleanor sat on the porch while the crickets sang and the stars wheeled overhead in their endless dance. She could hear Jacob moving around inside, the creak of floorboards marking his path through evening rituals she was learning to recognize. The door opened, and he emerged with 2 cups of coffee, handing her one without asking if she wanted it. They sat together in the darkness, not touching but close enough that Eleanor could feel his warmth in the cooling night air. 3 weeks left, Jacob said eventually. Yes. You could stay longer, if you wanted. The boys, they're better with you here. Anyone can see that. Eleanor's heart pounded. Jacob, I'm not asking for anything except what we already have, he said quickly. You teaching the boys, helping with the house. Same arrangement, but longer than a month. Stay through the summer at least. Give them time to really heal. It was tempting, so tempting, but Eleanor had learned hard lessons about temporary arrangements that became permanent traps. And then what? Another extension? Another season? When does it end, Jacob? When do I get to decide my own future instead of living in someone else's temporary need? That's fair, Jacob said quietly. I'm asking too much. You're asking me to risk getting even more attached to boys I'll have to leave eventually, Eleanor corrected. You're asking me to build a life I can't keep. What if you could keep it? The question hung between them, heavy with implications Eleanor wasn't ready to examine. Before she could respond, a sound from inside made them both turn. One of the boys was calling for her, nightmare again, and Eleanor rose automatically, setting down her coffee. We'll talk about this later, she said, and went inside to comfort children who weren't hers but were starting to feel like they might be. Behind her, Jacob remained on the porch,
staring out at the dark land he'd built his life on, wondering if he'd just made the worst mistake of his life by letting himself hope.
The conversation on the porch haunted Eleanor for the next 2 days. She went through the motions, teaching the boys, managing the house, learning the endless rhythms of ranch life. But Jacob's question echoed in her mind. What if you could keep it? What did that even mean? Marriage? Permanent employment? Some undefined arrangement that would leave her trapped between belonging and always being the outsider? She was still wrestling with it on the third night when she woke, not to screaming, but to the sharp smell of smoke. Eleanor's eyes snapped open. For a moment she thought she was dreaming, that the boy's nightmares had somehow infected her sleep. But no. The acrid scent was real, and when she sat up she could see an orange glow flickering through her window. Fire. She was out of bed and running before fear could freeze her. "Jacob!" she screamed, flinging open her door. "Jacob, fire!" He emerged from his room already pulling on boots, his face grim in the strange light. "Get the boys. Get them outside, away from the buildings. I'll handle the fire." Eleanor took the stairs 2 at a time, her heart in her throat. The upper floor was filling with smoke, not thick yet, but enough to make her eyes water. She could hear crackling now, hungry and close, coming from somewhere below. "Miles? Ethan!" She reached their beds and shook them awake. Both boys came up confused, disoriented, and then their eyes went wide with terror as they smelled the smoke. "No," Ethan whispered. "No, no, not again." "Listen to me," Eleanor said, gripping both their shoulders hard enough to hurt. "We're getting out. Right now. Stay with me. Stay close, and we're going to be fine." But Ethan had gone rigid with panic, his breathing coming in short, sharp gasps that Eleanor recognized as the beginning of a full breakdown. Miles grabbed his brother's hand, his own face pale with fear, but he stayed focused. "Come on," Miles urged. "Ethan, we have to go." Eleanor said we have to go. Eleanor scooped Ethan up. He was lighter than she expected, all bones and terror, and grabbed Miles's hand with her free arm. "Stay low. If the smoke gets bad, cover your mouth with your shirt. Don't let go of me." They made it down the stairs into chaos. The fire had started in the hay barn. Eleanor could see it through the window, flames climbing the dry wood with terrifying speed. But embers had jumped to the main house, and now the kitchen was burning, fire eating through the wall with hungry efficiency. Jacob was already there with buckets, trying to contain it, but Eleanor could see it was a losing battle. The summer had been too dry, the wind too strong. Everything was kindling, waiting for a spark. "Get them out!" Jacob shouted when he saw her. "Take them to the creek and stay there!" Eleanor didn't argue. She ran for the front door, Miles keeping pace beside her while Ethan clung to her neck, his face buried in her shoulder. Outside, the world had gone mad with firelight and shadow. The barn was fully engulfed now, flames reaching toward the star-filled sky. Embers drifted on the wind like hellish snow. Eleanor ran toward the creek, her bare feet finding stones and thorns but not stopping. Behind her she could hear Jacob shouting orders to himself, the crash of timbers as part of the barn collapsed. The horses were screaming in the corral, trapped, terrified. "The horses," Miles gasped. "Papa needs to get the horses." "Your father knows what he's doing," Eleanor said, though she wasn't sure she believed it. She reached the creek bank and set Ethan down in the shallow water, then pulled Miles in beside him. "Stay here. Don't move. I need to help your father." "No!" Both boys grabbed for her. "Don't leave us. Mama left and she never came back." Eleanor's heart shattered, but she made herself pry their hands loose. "I'm coming back. I promise you, I'm coming back. But your father needs help or we're going to lose everything." She ran back toward the inferno before she could let herself think about what she was doing. The heat hit her like a wall 20 feet from the house, so intense it felt like her skin might blister just from proximity. Jacob had given up on the house and was now focused on the corral, trying to get the panicked horses through the gate. Eleanor grabbed a bucket from the pump and started hauling water, throwing it on the embers that kept landing on the porch, the roof, anywhere the wind carried them. It was futile, like fighting a wildfire with a thimble, but she couldn't just stand there and watch everything burn. "Eleanor, get back to the boys!" Jacob shouted, fighting with a terrified mare that refused to leave the corral despite the open gate. "Not without you." Eleanor threw another bucket of water at a small fire trying to catch on the porch railing. "We do this together or not at all?" Jacob swore and finally got the mare moving. The other horses followed in a panicked stampede, heading for open ground away from the flames. Jacob ran to Eleanor, his face streaked with soot and sweat. "The house is lost," he said, his voice raw with smoke and something else. "We need to create a fire break before it spreads to the grazing land." They worked like demons possessed, using shovels to dig a trench in the hard summer earth, throwing dirt on every ember they could find. Eleanor's hands blistered and bled. Her lungs burned from smoke. But she didn't stop, couldn't stop, because behind her was everything Jacob had built, and ahead of her were two boys who'd already lost their mother to fire. The kitchen wall collapsed with a roar of sparks and flame. Part of the roof followed, timbers crashing inward. Eleanor watched 12 years of Jacob's life burn and wanted to weep, but there was no time for grief. Only work. Only the desperate race against fire and wind and fate. It took 3 hours. 3 hours of brutal labor, of watching the barn and half the house burn to ash, of fighting spot fires that kept springing up like evil flowers. But finally, the wind shifted. The fire lost its momentum. What remained continued to burn, but it was contained now, eating itself rather than spreading. Eleanor collapsed to her knees in the dirt, coughing so hard she thought her ribs might crack. Jacob dropped beside her, his hands raw and bleeding, his face gray with exhaustion and shock. "The boys," Eleanor gasped. "I need to check on the boys." She tried to stand, but her legs wouldn't hold her. Jacob caught her before she fell, his strong hand steadying her even though he was shaking too. "I'll go," he said. "You did enough. More than enough." "Together," Eleanor insisted. "We go together." They stumbled toward the creek like two drunks, holding each other up. The eastern sky was beginning to pale with the first hint of dawn, and in that gray light, Eleanor could see the full extent of the damage. The barn was gone. The kitchen and back half of the house were destroyed. Outbuildings had burn marks. The corral fence had collapsed. But the boys were safe. She could see them huddled by the creek where she'd left them, and that was all that mattered. Miles saw them first and came running, Ethan right behind him. They hit their father like small cannonballs, and Jacob went down to his knees, wrapping both boys in his arms and holding them so tight Eleanor could see him trembling. "You're alive," Ethan sobbed. "You didn't burn. You didn't leave us." "Never," Jacob said, his voice breaking. "Never, boys. I'm right here." Eleanor stood apart, watching the family reunion and feeling suddenly like the intruder she'd always been. This was their tragedy, their survival, their moment. She had no right to be part of it. But then Miles pulled away from his father and ran to Eleanor, wrapping his arms around her waist. "You came back," he said fiercely. "You promised, and you came back." "Of course I did," Eleanor said, running her hand through his smoke-tangled hair. "I'll always come back. I promised, didn't I?" Ethan joined his brother, and Eleanor found herself holding both boys while Jacob watched with an expression she couldn't read. They stood like that as the sun rose over the ruins, 4 people who'd survived the night but didn't yet know what came next. The days that followed were a blur of salvage and survival. They moved what remained of their possessions into the front part of the house, the section that hadn't burned. Jacob and the boys slept in the main room while Eleanor took the only intact bedroom. They cooked over an outdoor fire pit since the kitchen was gone. They washed in the creek and rationed water and made do with a fraction of what they'd had before. Neighbors came to help once word spread. Ranchers Eleanor had never met showed up with lumber and tools and strong backs, working alongside Jacob to shore up what remained and start planning repairs. The community that had seemed so hostile when Eleanor first arrived proved itself capable of surprising compassion in the face of disaster. But not everyone was helpful. On the 4th day after the fire, a rider appeared at midday while Jacob was working on the barn foundation with 2 neighboring ranchers. Eleanor was teaching the boys under a cottonwood tree by the creek, trying to maintain some normalcy despite the chaos. She looked up when she heard horses and felt her stomach drop. Tom Miller sat astride a fine bay gelding, and he wasn't alone. 3 other men flanked him, rough-looking types that made Eleanor think of the cowboys who'd chased her through Copper Ridge that first day. Jacob saw them too and straightened, his hammer still in hand. The neighboring ranchers exchanged glances and moved to stand with him. The air went tight with tension. "Tom," Jacob said, his voice neutral. "What brings you out here?" "Heard you had some trouble," Tom said, his smile not reaching his eyes. "Thought we'd come see if there was anything left worth saving." "We're managing fine. Don't need your help." "That's so." Tom's gaze swept over the burned buildings, the makeshift camp, and landed on Eleanor and the boys. "Seems like you could use all the help you can get, especially with mouths to feed that ain't even yours." Eleanor stood slowly, placing herself between the boys and the mounted men. Miles and Ethan pressed against her back, silent and watchful. "Eleanor's part of this household," Jacob said carefully. "What concerns my family doesn't concern you." "See, that's interesting," Tom said, "because I've been hearing things about how you brought this woman out here under questionable circumstances, about how she's living in your house without benefit of marriage or proper chaperone, about how that might not be appropriate." One of the neighboring ranchers, a man named Charlie Peterson, spat in the dirt. "Tom, if you've got something to say it straight instead of dancing around like a fool." Tom's smile went sharp and mean. "All right then, straight talk. I've filed a complaint with the territorial judge, alleging that Jacob Reed is harboring a woman of questionable virtue and exposing his minor children to moral corruption. The judge is very interested in investigating these allegations." Eleanor felt like she'd been punched. "That's absurd. I'm a teacher. I'm here to educate the boys." "Is that what they're calling it these days?" Tom's gaze raked over her in a way that made her skin crawl. "Funny how you showed up in a wedding dress for a man who didn't want you, and now you're playing house with a widower and his kids. Makes a man wonder what else you're willing to do to secure yourself a home." Jacob moved so fast Eleanor barely saw it. One moment he was standing by the barn, the next he'd crossed the space between them and dragged Tom off his horse. They hit the ground hard, Jacob's fist connecting with Tom's jaw before anyone could intervene. "You take that back," Jacob growled, his forearm across Tom's throat. "You apologize to her right now." Tom laughed, spitting blood. "Truth hurts, don't it? And the judge will want to know the truth. About the nature of your relationship with Miss Hayes. About whether she's a fit influence for your boys. About whether you're a fit father, letting strange women into your home so soon after your wife's death." The other men with Tom had dismounted now, hands on their weapons. Charlie and the other neighbor moved to back Jacob up. The situation was escalating toward violence, and Eleanor knew with cold certainty that if this turned into a fight, Tom would use it as further evidence against them. "Stop," Eleanor said loudly. "Jacob, let him go." Jacob didn't move, his eyes locked on Tom with murderous intent. "Please," Eleanor added quietly, "this is what he wants. Don't give him ammunition." Jacob's jaw worked, but finally he released Tom and stood. Tom climbed to his feet, still grinning despite the blood on his face. "Smart woman," Tom said. "Smarter than your boss, anyway. The judge will be by within the week to conduct his investigation. I suggest you prepare your story carefully, Miss Hayes, because if the judge finds evidence of impropriety, those boys will be removed from this house faster than you can blink." He swung back onto his horse, his companions following suit. "Oh, and Jacob, you might want to consider whether keeping her around is worth risking your sons. Because I guarantee you the judge won't look kindly on a man who puts his own comfort above his children's welfare." They rode off, leaving a cloud of dust and sick dread in their wake. Jacob turned to Eleanor, his face stricken. "I'm sorry, I should have—" "You should have what? Known that Tom Miller is vindictive enough to weaponize territorial law?" Eleanor shook her head. "This isn't your fault. It's my responsibility," Jacob said. "You're here because of me, and now you're being attacked because of me." Charlie cleared his throat. "Jacob, listen. Tom's been looking for a way to hurt you since you beat him in that land dispute 2 years ago. This ain't about Eleanor. It's about him wanting revenge and seeing an opportunity." "Doesn't matter what it's about," Jacob said heavily. "What matters is the judge will come and he'll investigate, and if he finds any reason to believe the boys are in an improper situation, then we make sure he doesn't find one," Eleanor interrupted. She was thinking fast now, her mind racing through possibilities and consequences. "I'll leave." "What?" Jacob and both boys spoke simultaneously, their voices sharp with panic. "I'll go back to Copper Ridge, find a room at the boarding house," Eleanor continued. "Remove myself from the situation entirely. Then there's nothing for the judge to investigate. No impropriety, no scandal, just a teacher who was temporarily employed and has now left." "No," Miles said, grabbing her hand. "You can't go. You promised you wouldn't leave us." "I promised I wouldn't disappear without warning," Eleanor corrected gently. "This is different. This is me leaving to protect you." "It's exactly the same," Ethan's voice cracked. "Everyone leaves. Everyone dies or goes away, and we're always alone again." Eleanor dropped to her knees in front of the boys, taking both their hands. "Listen to me. If I stay and the judge decides your father is unfit because of me, you could be taken away from him, sent to live with strangers, split up, put in institutions. I won't risk that. I won't be the reason you lose everything." "There has to be another way," Jacob said, his voice raw. "There is," Charlie said quietly. Everyone turned to look at him. He shifted uncomfortably under the attention. "You could marry her." Silence fell like a stone. "What?" Eleanor managed. "Makes sense," Charlie continued, warming to his argument. "You need a mother for the boys. Eleanor needs a home and protection. Get married, make it legal and proper, and Tom's got nothing. The judge can't complain about impropriety if you're man and wife." "That's insane," Eleanor said. "We barely know each other. Marriage it's not something you do to win a legal dispute." "People marry for all kinds of reasons out here," Charlie said pragmatically. "Love's a luxury. Partnership, mutual need, convenience, those are the foundations most marriages are built on in the territories. And from what I've seen, you two work well together. The boys love her, Jacob, and she clearly cares about them. That's more than a lot of couples start with." Jacob was staring at Eleanor with an expression she couldn't read. "It's your choice," he said finally. "I won't force you into anything, but if you're willing, it would solve the problem." Eleanor's mind spun. Marriage. To a man she'd known for less than a month. A man whose dead wife's dresses she wore, whose sons she was growing to love, whose grief still hung over this burned ranch like smoke. But what were her alternatives? Go back to Copper Ridge and watch from a distance as Tom Miller destroyed this family out of spite? Return east to nothing and no one, carrying the guilt of abandoning children who'd already been abandoned too many times? She looked at the boys, Miles and Ethan watching her with desperate hope in their eyes, already bracing for another loss. She looked at Jacob, steady and strong despite everything, offering her a choice that was really no choice at all. She looked at the burned buildings and the salvaged life and the community that had rallied around them, and she made her decision. "All right," Eleanor said. "I'll marry you." The wedding happened 3 days later in the front room of what remained of the Reed house. Charlie Peterson served as witness along with his wife Martha. The circuit preacher, who happened to be passing through, conducted the ceremony with professional efficiency and no questions about the hasty nature of the union. Eleanor wore a simple dress borrowed from Martha. Her wedding dress was still stuffed in the bottom of the trunk, and she couldn't bring herself to look at it. Jacob wore his cleanest shirt and pants, his hair still damp from washing. The boys stood beside them, solemn and watchful, not quite understanding what was happening, but understanding it was important. The vows were brief, the kiss perfunctory, the ring a simple band Jacob had commissioned from the blacksmith in town. 20 minutes after it started, Eleanor Hayes became Eleanor Reed, and the temporary arrangement she'd agreed to 1 month ago became permanent in the eyes of law and society. The preacher left. Charlie and Martha congratulated them awkwardly and departed. And then it was just the four of them, Eleanor, Jacob, Miles, and Ethan, standing in the ruins of the old life and the uncertain beginning of the new one. "Well," Jacob said after a long silence, "that's done." "Yes," Eleanor agreed. They looked at each other, two strangers who were now legally bound, and Eleanor wondered what she'd just committed herself to. That night, Jacob insisted on sleeping outside by the fire pit while Eleanor took the bedroom. The boys slept in the main room as they had been since the fire. It was all very proper and careful, everyone maintaining appropriate distance despite the marriage certificate that said they were now family. Eleanor lay awake listening to the night sounds and trying to process what she'd done. Married. She was married to Jacob Reed, mother to his sons, mistress of a half-burned ranch in the middle of Montana. It was so far from anything she'd imagined for her life that she couldn't quite believe it was real. The judge arrived the following afternoon. He was a severe-looking man named Judge Harrison, riding a fine horse and accompanied by a clerk who took notes on everything. Tom Miller rode with them, his smile triumphant as he dismounted. "Mr. Reed," Judge Harrison said formally, "I'm here to investigate allegations of impropriety in your household, specifically regarding the presence of an unmarried woman living with you and your minor children." Jacob stepped forward, his face carefully neutral. "The allegations are false, Your Honor. Eleanor is my wife. We were married 3 days ago by Circuit Preacher Morrison. Charlie Peterson and his wife served as witnesses." The judge's eyebrows rose. Tom's smile faltered. "Your wife," Judge Harrison repeated. "Yes, sir. Eleanor Reed, formerly Eleanor Hayes. We married in the presence of witnesses and in accordance with territorial law." Jacob pulled out the marriage certificate. "All legal and proper." The judge examined the certificate carefully, his clerk looking over his shoulder and making notes. Tom's face had gone red with fury. "This is convenient timing," Tom said sharply. "Awfully convenient that Reed suddenly marries this woman right before your investigation." "The timing is irrelevant," Judge Harrison said. "The marriage is legal, which means there's no impropriety to investigate. Mr. Miller, you've wasted my time and the territory's resources on a complaint that has no merit." "But she was living here unmarried for weeks," Tom protested. That's still not illegal," the judge interrupted. "Unusual, perhaps, but not grounds for removing children from their father's custody." He turned to Eleanor, who'd been standing silently on the porch. "Mrs. Reed, I assume you're here of your own free will?" Eleanor stepped forward, meeting the judge's gaze directly. "I am, Your Honor. I came to Montana to marry another man who changed his mind. Mr. Reed offered me employment teaching his sons. Over the course of that employment, we grew to respect each other and decided to marry. It may have been quick by Eastern standards, but as I understand it, such arrangements are common in the territories."
"They are, indeed," the judge agreed. He studied Eleanor for a moment longer, then nodded. "You seem a capable woman, Mrs. Reed. Your husband and sons are fortunate to have you." He remounted his horse, his clerk scrambling to follow. Tom remained on the ground, his face twisted with impotent rage. "This isn't over, Reed," Tom said quietly. "Yes, it is," Jacob replied. "You've got no complaint, no grounds, no case. Leave my family alone, Tom, because next time you come at us, I won't be so restrained." Tom spat in the dirt at Jacob's feet, a final gesture of contempt, and swung onto his horse. He rode off without another word, but the look in his eyes promised that Jacob was right. This wasn't over. That night, for the first time since the fire, the boys slept without nightmares. Eleanor sat by their beds, watching them breathe in the peaceful rhythm of true rest, and realized that whatever happened next, she'd made the right choice. She'd chosen to stay, to fight, to become part of this broken family and help them heal, even if it meant binding herself to a man she barely knew and a life she'd never imagined. Jacob found her there an hour later, still keeping vigil. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for today, for all of it. You didn't have to—" "Yes, I did," Eleanor interrupted. "They're my sons now too, legally, officially, and I protect what's mine." Something shifted in Jacob's expression. Surprise, gratitude, something else Eleanor couldn't name. "Eleanor, about the marriage. I want you to know I don't expect, that is, we can keep things as they've been. Separate rooms, separate lives, mostly. This doesn't have to change anything you're not ready to change." Eleanor looked at him, this man who'd saved her from disaster, who'd given her purpose and family and a home despite his own grief. "What do you want it to be, Jacob?" He was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, "I want to stop feeling like I'm drowning. I want my boys to smile again. I want to rebuild what the fire took and make something better from the ashes." He paused. "And I want to know that when I wake up tomorrow, you'll still be here, that this is real." "It's real," Eleanor said softly. "I'm here, and I'm not going anywhere."
She meant it. For better or worse, for richer or poorer, in fire and fear and uncertain futures, she was Eleanor Reed now, and she would stand her ground. The fragile peace lasted exactly 9 days. Eleanor had fallen into the rhythm of being Mrs. Reed with surprising ease. She taught the boys in the mornings, worked alongside Jacob on rebuilding efforts in the afternoons, and fell into bed each night so exhausted she barely had energy to think about the strangeness of her situation. The marriage certificate hung on the wall where the judge had seen it, proof of legitimacy, but the reality of what it meant remained undefined and unspoken between her and Jacob. They were partners in survival, nothing more. At least that's what Eleanor told herself when she caught Jacob watching her with an expression that made her heart skip, or when their hands brushed reaching for the same tool and neither pulled away quite fast enough. The boys, at least, had accepted the change with relief that bordered on joy. They called her Eleanor still, not Mother, but there was a possessiveness in the way they stayed close to her now, a certainty that she belonged to them just as much as they belonged to her. On the 9th night, Eleanor was washing dishes in the makeshift outdoor kitchen when she heard horses approaching fast, too fast, the kind of speed that meant urgency or trouble, and she'd learned to distinguish between the two. Jacob heard it too. He emerged from the barn with his rifle, his face already set in hard lines. "Get the boys inside, now!" Eleanor didn't argue. She wiped her hands and hurried to where Miles and Ethan were playing near the creek. "Come on, boys, inside." "But we're not done," Miles started. "Now," Eleanor said, her tone brooking no argument. Something in her voice made both boys scramble to obey. They'd just reached the porch when the riders appeared, 5 men, heavily armed, their faces shadowed by the twilight. Tom Miller led them, but these weren't the same cowboys who'd accompanied him before. These were harder men, meaner, the kind who hired out their guns and didn't ask too many questions about the work. Eleanor's blood ran cold. She pushed the boys behind her and stepped forward to stand beside Jacob, ignoring his sharp look that clearly said she should be inside. "Tom," Jacob said, his voice deadly calm, "you're trespassing, and you brought friends who look like they're spoiling for trouble." "No trouble," Tom said, though his smile said otherwise. "Just here to deliver some news. See, I did some digging after the judge's visit. Turns out your new wife has some interesting history back east." Eleanor felt ice slide down her spine. Jacob's grip tightened on his rifle. "What are you talking about?" Jacob asked. Tom pulled a folded paper from his jacket. "Got a telegram from a lawyer in Boston. Seems Miss Eleanor Hayes, Mrs. Reed, was contracted to marry a man named James Calloway. Legal contract signed and witnessed, promising marriage in exchange for travel funds and other considerations. That contract was voided when Calloway broke the engagement," Eleanor said, forcing her voice to stay steady. "Was it?" Tom's smile widened. "Because according to this lawyer, Calloway's willing to pursue breach of contract. Says you took his money under false pretenses. Says you owe him restitution, $500, or the original contracted marriage." Jacob's laugh was harsh and humorless. "That's ridiculous. You can't enforce a contract to marry someone who doesn't want to marry you." "Maybe not," Tom agreed. "But you can sue for breach and damages, and Calloway's lawyer is very interested in doing just that. Says he'll file in territorial court, which means Eleanor here will have to appear and defend herself. Could take months, could cost a lot of money you don't have." "What do you want, Tom?" Jacob's voice had gone dangerously quiet. Tom leaned forward in his saddle. "I want you broken, Reed. I want you to lose everything the way I lost that land because of your interference. And I'll use whatever tools I have to make that happen." His gaze shifted to Eleanor. "Including your convenient wife." "You're insane," Eleanor said. "James Calloway doesn't want me. He married someone else. He has no interest in pursuing any contract." "He does now," Tom said. "Once I explained how much trouble you've caused me, how you're the reason my complaint failed. Calloway was very sympathetic, very interested in causing you some hardship in return." Eleanor understood then. This wasn't about the contract or the money. This was Tom finding another angle of attack, another way to hurt Jacob through her. And the terrible thing was, it might work. Even a frivolous lawsuit could tie them up in legal proceedings, cost them money they needed for rebuilding, force Eleanor to travel back east and leave the boys for months. "We'll fight it," Jacob said. "Get a lawyer, Prove the contract was breached by Calloway's actions. You won't win this, Tom. Maybe not, Tom said, but I'll make you bleed for it, and while you're busy fighting in court, well, he gestured to his armed companions. Accidents happen on isolated ranches. Fires start. Cattle wander off. Buildings collapse. It'd be a shame if anything happened to what you've been working so hard to rebuild. It was a threat as clear as day, spoken in front of witnesses who wouldn't testify against Tom even if their lives depended on it. Jacob understood it too. Eleanor could see the calculation in his eyes, weighing options and finding them all lacking. Get off my land, Jacob said quietly. Before I forget I'm a civilized man. We're going, Tom said. But think about what I said. Maybe Eleanor decides to honor her original contract after all. Maybe she goes back to Calloway, gets this mess sorted out nice and legal. Then there's no lawsuit, no trouble, no accidents. Everyone walks away clean. That's not happening, Eleanor said firmly. Tom shrugged. Your choice. But choices have consequences out here, Mrs. Reed. You'd do well to remember that. They rode off into the gathering darkness, leaving behind the smell of gun oil and malice. Jacob stood motionless until the sound of hoofbeats faded completely, then turned to Eleanor. How binding is this contract? He asked. Eleanor's hands were shaking. She clasped them together to hide it. I signed it. Calloway advanced me money for travel and the dress. But he broke the engagement, Jacob. He married someone else. No court would enforce it. Territorial courts are unpredictable, Jacob said. Especially if Tom's got the judge's ear, which he might. His cousin's the sheriff, remember? These things are all connected out here. So what do we do? Jacob was quiet for a long moment, staring at the darkness where Tom had disappeared. Finally, he looked at her. We prepare for a fight, and we make sure the boys are protected no matter what happens. That night, Eleanor couldn't sleep. She lay in her small bedroom, listening to the house settle and thinking about contracts and consequences and the fact that her past had followed her across 2,000 miles to threaten the fragile life she'd built. She must have eventually dozed because she woke to the sound of breaking glass. Eleanor was on her feet instantly, her heart pounding. Another crash, this one from the main room, shouting. Jacob's voice, sharp with alarm. She grabbed the fire poker from her cold stove and ran into the main room to find chaos. The front window had been shattered, and through the broken glass she could see torches moving in the darkness outside. Someone was shooting, not at the house yet, but close enough to send a message. Jacob had the boys on the floor, shielding them with his body while he tried to reach his rifle. Eleanor dropped beside them, the poker gripped tight in her hands. How many? She gasped. Can't tell. At least 4. Jacob's face was grim. They're trying to draw me out. Want me to come outside so they can... A bullet tore through the broken window and embedded itself in the wall 6 inches from Eleanor's head. Down! Jacob shouted, and they all flattened. More shots followed, systematic and deliberate. Not trying to kill anyone inside, but definitely trying to terrorize. Eleanor heard glass breaking in other rooms, heard something heavy hit the roof. They were surrounding the house. The boys, Eleanor said urgently. We need to get them somewhere safe. There's a root cellar, Jacob said, through the kitchen. Eleanor, can you get them there while I hold them off? You can't fight them all alone. I don't have a choice. Jacob's eyes were fierce. They want me to come out. They want a confrontation. But they won't expect me to have backup. Get the boys safe, then get the shotgun from my room. You know how to shoot? I can learn fast. A ghost of a smile crossed Jacob's face despite everything. That's my girl. Go. Now. Eleanor grabbed both boys and ran in a crouch toward the kitchen, praying none of the shooters had circled around to that side yet. She found the cellar door where Jacob said it would be, a trapdoor set into the floor, leading down into darkness. Down, she told the boys. Quickly now. What about you? Ethan's voice was small and terrified. What about Papa? We're going to be fine, Eleanor lied, but I need you both to hide here and not come out no matter what you hear. Can you do that for me? Miles grabbed her hand. Don't die, he whispered. Please don't die like Mama. Eleanor's heart broke, but she made herself smile. I have no intention of dying. I've got too much work to do. She kissed both their foreheads quickly. Hide. Stay quiet. I'll come for you when it's safe. She lowered them into the cellar and closed the door, shoving a heavy flour sack over it for concealment. Then she ran to Jacob's room and found the shotgun exactly where he'd said it would be, already loaded. Back in the main room, Jacob had returned fire through the broken window. The sound was deafening in the enclosed space. Eleanor dropped beside him, the shotgun heavy in her hands. "They're not rushing the house," Jacob reported. "They want to flush us out or burn us out. And my bet is—" The smell of smoke reached them at the same moment. "Fire," Eleanor breathed. "They're setting another fire." Jacob swore viciously. "They torched something upwind. It'll spread to the house within minutes." He looked at Eleanor, and she saw desperation in his eyes. "We can't stay here. We have to run for it." "With the boys in the cellar?" "We get them and we run for the creek. It's our only chance." They were moving before the words fully registered, racing back to the kitchen. Eleanor threw open the cellar door while Jacob provided cover, firing at shadows and movement in the darkness outside. The boys climbed out, their faces pale with terror in the growing firelight. Because the house was burning now. Eleanor could see flames climbing the outside wall, could feel the heat building. The rebuilt life they'd fought so hard for was being destroyed again, and this time it was deliberate murder disguised as harassment. "Out the back," Jacob commanded. "Stay low. Stay together. We make for the creek and we don't stop for anything." They ran. The back door opened onto chaos, smoke and firelight and the crack of gunfire. Eleanor held tight to both boys' hands while Jacob led the way, his rifle ready. They made it 10 feet before a figure emerged from the smoke, gun raised. Jacob fired first. The man went down with a scream. Another appeared to their right, and this time Eleanor didn't think, just raised the shotgun and pulled the trigger. The recoil nearly knocked her over, but the man dropped, and they kept running. The creek was 30 yards away. 20. 10. They were going to make it, Eleanor thought desperately. They were actually going to— The bullet took Jacob in the shoulder and spun him around. He went down hard, his rifle flying from his hands. Eleanor screamed and dropped beside him, the boys right behind her. "Keep going," Jacob gasped, his face gray with pain and shock. "Get the boys to safety." "Not without you," Eleanor said fiercely. She looked at Miles and Ethan. "Help me. We're getting your father up." Together, the four of them managed to get Jacob to his feet. He swayed, his left arm hanging useless, but he could move. They stumbled toward the creek while bullets kicked up dirt around them and the house burned like a funeral pyre behind them. They made it to the water just as Eleanor heard horses approaching. But these weren't Tom's men. She recognized Charlie Peterson's voice shouting, recognized the arrival of help finally coming. Eleanor lowered Jacob into the shallow water, the cold helping to shock him back toward consciousness. The boys pressed against his good side while Eleanor tore strips from her nightgown to bind the wound in his shoulder. Charlie appeared with 3 other ranchers, all armed, all grim-faced. "We saw the fire from my place. Came as fast as we could. Tom Miller," Jacob managed. "He brought hired guns, tried to burn us out." "We saw them running when we approached," Charlie said. "Didn't get close enough to identify anyone, but we all know who's responsible." His face was hard. "This has gone too far, Jacob. Way too far." Eleanor looked back at the burning house, her home, the place where she'd become Eleanor Reed, where she'd found family and purpose. All of it going up in flames again because Tom Miller couldn't let go of a grudge. Something inside her hardened into steel. "Where would Tom go?" she asked quietly. "Where would he run to after this?" "Eleanor, no," Jacob said, reading her intent. "You're not going after him." "Someone has to," Eleanor interrupted. "He just tried to murder us, Jacob. All of us, including the boys. And if we don't stop him now, he'll keep coming. He'll keep finding ways to hurt us until there's nothing left." Charlie shifted uncomfortably. "She's not wrong. Tom's crossed a line tonight, but going after him vigilante style will just—" "Will just what?" Eleanor demanded. "His cousin's the sheriff. You think there'll be justice through official channels? No. Tom will claim he was nowhere near here, his hired guns will disappear, and in a month he'll come back to finish what he started." She looked at Jacob. "I won't let that happen. I won't let him take this family from me." Jacob stared at her, something like awe and terror mixing in his expression. "What are you planning?" Eleanor smiled, and it wasn't a kind smile. "I'm going to give Tom Miller exactly what he asked for. I'm going to face the contract dispute head on. but not the way he expects. 3 days later, Eleanor rode into Copper Ridge with Jacob beside her, his arm in a sling but his spine straight, and the boys in the wagon bed behind them. Charlie Peterson and half a dozen other ranchers rode escort, their presence making it clear this wasn't a woman coming to town in fear. They went straight to the telegraph office. Eleanor sent 3 telegrams in rapid succession. The first to James Calloway's lawyer in Boston, written in language so precise and legally sound that the telegraph operator's eyes widened as he transcribed it. The second to a women's rights organization Eleanor had worked with briefly in her teaching days. The third to the territorial governor himself. Then she walked to the saloon where Tom Miller typically spent his afternoons and pushed through the doors like she owned the place. The conversation died instantly. Every head turned. Tom sat at a back table with cards in his hand and a drink at his elbow, and when he saw Eleanor, his smile turned predatory. "Well, well," he said loudly, "if it isn't the widow Reed, come to accept my generous offer?" "I've come to make you one," Eleanor said, her voice carrying to every corner of the room. "You drop this fraudulent contract claim, you leave my family alone, and I don't destroy you." Tom laughed. "You? Destroy me?" "Sweetheart, you barely survived the last few days. Your house is ash. Your husband's wounded. You've got nothing." "I have the truth," Eleanor said calmly, "and I have witnesses. Witnesses who will testify that you hired armed men to attack a family in their home, that you attempted murder, that you've been conducting a campaign of harassment and intimidation for months." "My cousin's the sheriff," Tom reminded her, still grinning. "Your witnesses won't mean much." "They will to the territorial governor," Eleanor said. "I've already sent him a full account, along with a request for investigation into corruption in the Copper Ridge Sheriff's Office. I've also contacted the Boston Herald newspaper with the story of how territorial landowners are using legal extortion and violence to control women and drive out competition. They were very interested." Tom's smile faltered. "And as for the contract," Eleanor continued, pulling out a paper she'd drafted with Charlie's wife Martha, who'd been a legal clerk before moving west. "I've documented every aspect of James Calloway's breach, including the fact that he married another woman while I was en route to marry him. I've sworn affidavits from witnesses who saw me stranded and destitute at the train station because of his abandonment. And I've contacted a women's advocacy group that specializes in challenging predatory marriage contracts. They're very eager to make this a test case." She stepped closer to Tom's table, and her voice dropped to something deadly quiet. "So here's what's going to happen, Tom. You're going to withdraw the contract claim. You're going to leave my family alone. And you're going to disappear from our lives completely. Because if you don't, I will make it my personal mission to ensure that everyone from here to Washington knows exactly what kind of man you are." Tom's face had gone red. "You're bluffing." "Try me," Eleanor said softly. "I've already lost everything once. I rebuilt from nothing, and I will burn down every obstacle between me and protecting my family, starting with you. So ask yourself, do you really want to find out how far I'm willing to go?" The saloon was silent. Tom looked around as if expecting support, but the other men avoided his gaze. Everyone could see the writing on the wall. Eleanor Reed had just declared war, and she'd brought weapons Tom hadn't anticipated. Not guns or fists, but words and law and the kind of righteous fury that could move mountains. Finally, Tom threw his cards down. "Fine, the contract's dropped, but this isn't over." "Yes, it is," Jacob said from the doorway, stepping inside with Charlie and the other ranchers behind him. "Because if it's not, Tom, you won't be dealing with just Eleanor anymore. You'll be dealing with every rancher in this county who's sick of your games, and we won't be using words." The threat hung in the air, violence as a last resort, but violence nonetheless if pushed. Tom looked from Jacob to Eleanor to the gathered men and saw his options narrowing to nothing. "Get out of my sight," he finally spat. "Gladly," Eleanor said. "Enjoy your drink, Tom. It's the last victory you'll have over this family." She walked out with her head high, Jacob at her side, and the knowledge that she'd just fought her first real battle for her new life and won. That night, they made camp under the stars on the journey back to the ranch. The boys slept in the wagon while Eleanor and Jacob sat by the fire, not speaking for a long time. Finally, Jacob broke the silence. "Where did that come from? In the saloon? That wasn't the teacher I hired a month ago. Eleanor smiled into the flames. That was the woman who survived being abandoned in a hostile town with nothing. The woman who learned that the only way to protect yourself is to become too dangerous to attack. She looked at him. Did I overstep? Overstep? Jacob laughed, the sound genuinely amused for the first time since she'd known him. Eleanor, you terrified every man in that room, including me. You were magnificent. I meant what I said, Eleanor said quietly, about protecting this family, about burning down obstacles. I know this marriage started as a legal convenience, but these boys, they're mine now. And I don't let anyone hurt what's mine. Jacob reached over and took her hand, the first time he'd initiated touch since their wedding kiss. I know. I saw it in your eyes that first night with the nightmares. You're not just teaching them anymore. You're their mother in every way that matters. Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes. And what are we, Jacob? You and me. He was quiet, his thumb tracing circles on her palm. I don't know yet, he admitted, but I know I trust you with my life, with my sons' lives. I know I'm grateful every day that you didn't get on that train back east, and I know that when I thought Tom's bullet had killed you tonight, He stopped, his voice roughening. I couldn't breathe. Eleanor's heart pounded. Jacob. I'm not asking for anything you're not ready to give, he said quickly. I just need you to know that this marriage might have started as convenience, but for me, it stopped being that somewhere along the way. You're not just my wife on paper anymore, Eleanor. You're the bravest woman I've ever known, and He trailed off, searching for words. Eleanor squeezed his hand. One step at a time, she said gently. We rebuild the house. We heal. We help the boys keep getting better. And we figure out what we are to each other along the way. One step at a time, Jacob agreed. They sat together until the fire burned low, hands joined, watching the stars wheel overhead and knowing that whatever came next, they would face it together. The battle with Tom Miller was over. But the real work, the work of becoming a family, had only just begun. The rebuilding began the morning after they returned from Copper Ridge, before the sun had fully crested the horizon. Eleanor woke to the sound of hammers and voices, and when she stepped outside, she found half the county already assembled in their yard. Ranchers she'd never met, their wives carrying baskets of food, their children running between the workers. Everyone had come to help raise the Reed house from its ashes. Charlie Peterson directed the work with the efficiency of a general commanding troops. Foundation's still solid, he called out. We frame it the same as before, but add a proper kitchen extension. Eleanor, Martha's got some ideas about the layout if you want to give input. Eleanor found herself swept into planning discussions with women who'd been strangers a month ago and were now offering advice on window placement and pantry design like she was one of their own. It was overwhelming and wonderful and completely foreign to someone who'd spent most of her life being told she didn't quite fit anywhere. You'll want the stove here, Martha said, sketching in the dirt with a stick. Catches the morning light but stays cool in the afternoon heat. And a bigger wash basin, trust me, with boys you'll need it. I was thinking, another woman named Sue added, that you might want a separate schoolroom. Word is you're a real teacher, and there's families out here who'd pay to send their children if you're willing to take them on. Eleanor blinked. A school? Here? Why not? Sue gestured at the land around them. Nearest school is 20 miles, and half these kids can't make that journey daily. But if you're teaching the Reed boys anyway, and you've got the training, seems like it'd be good for everyone. The idea took root in Eleanor's mind immediately. A school. Not just teaching Miles and Ethan, but creating something permanent, something that would serve the whole community. It felt right in a way she couldn't quite articulate, like pieces of her old life and new life were finally fitting together into something that made sense. I'd need supplies, Eleanor said slowly. Books, slates, proper desks. We'll figure it out, Martha said firmly. Ranchers can contribute what they can afford. Won't be fancy, but it'll be real education. Better than most of these kids have access to now. Jacob appeared at Eleanor's elbow, his wounded arm still in a sling, but his face less drawn than it had been. You thinking about starting a school? Maybe, Eleanor admitted, if you don't mind the house being overrun with other people's children. Mind?
Jacob's expression softened in a way that made Eleanor's heart skip. Eleanor, you've already given my boys back their voices and their hope.
If you want to do the same for the whole county, I'll help you build whatever you need to make it happen. By the end of the first week, the house had walls again. By the end of the second, it had a roof and windows and a kitchen that was twice the size of the original. The men worked sunrise to sunset while the women organized meals and kept children occupied, and Eleanor found herself part of a community she hadn't known existed. The boys thrived in the chaos. Miles and Ethan helped where they could, fetching tools and holding boards steady, their faces bright with an enthusiasm Eleanor hadn't seen before. And at night, when the workers went home and the four of them ate dinner together in the partially finished house, the boys talked. Really talked. Not just answering questions, but volunteering stories about their day, asking about tomorrow's plans, arguing good-naturedly about who had hammered more nails. "They're healing," Jacob said one night after the boys had gone to bed. He and Eleanor sat on the new porch, watching the stars emerge. "I can see it happening. Every day they're a little more like they were before. Before everything." "They'll always carry the loss," Eleanor said quietly. "But maybe they're learning they can carry it without it crushing them." Jacob was silent for a moment. Then, "I need to tell you something. About Sarah. About how she died." Eleanor turned to look at him, surprised. In all their weeks together, Jacob had barely mentioned his first wife beyond the basic facts. "The fire," Jacob continued, his voice rough with old pain. "It started in the kitchen. Middle of winter, we were trying to keep warm and she was cooking supper. The boys were upstairs playing. I was outside dealing with a fence breach. By the time I saw the smoke..." He stopped, swallowed hard. "The kitchen was already gone. Sarah was trying to get upstairs to the boys, but the stairs had caught. I got the boys out through their window, got them to safety. But when I went back for Sarah, the whole structure was coming down." "Jacob," Eleanor breathed, her hand finding his. "She was trapped," he said. "Could see her through the smoke, could hear her calling for me, but the heat was too intense, the building too unstable. I tried 3 times to get to her, and each time the fire drove me back. The boys were screaming for their mother. Neighbors were holding me back, and all I could do was watch her." His voice broke. "Watch her burn." Eleanor wrapped both hands around his, holding tight. "I'm so sorry." "The boys saw it," Jacob continued. "Not the worst of it, but enough. Enough to give them nightmares for 3 years. Enough to make them terrified every time they smell smoke. And I blamed myself. Still do. If I'd been there 5 minutes earlier, if I'd insisted we rebuild the chimney that winter instead of waiting for spring, if I'd done 1,000 things differently..." "It was an accident," Eleanor said firmly. "A terrible, tragic accident. Not your fault." "I know that up here," Jacob tapped his head. "But here..." He pressed his free hand to his chest. "Here. I'm still standing outside that burning house watching my world end and being completely powerless to stop it." Eleanor understood then why he'd been so desperate to save her from Tom Miller's attack, why he'd thrown himself in front of that bullet. Jacob Reed had already lost one woman he cared about to violence he couldn't prevent. He wouldn't survive losing another. "I won't burn," Eleanor said quietly. "And I won't leave. You're stuck with me, Jacob Reed, for better or worse." He looked at her then, really looked at her in the starlight, and Eleanor saw something shift in his expression. The careful distance he'd been maintaining since their marriage cracked, and underneath was raw want mixed with fear. "Eleanor," he said hoarsely, "I need to know. Is this marriage real for you? Not just the legal part, but us. Is there an us, or am I hoping for something you can't give?" Eleanor's heart pounded. She thought about the past weeks, about the way her pulse jumped when Jacob smiled, the way she'd felt when she thought Tom's men might have killed him, the way she'd fought like a wildcat to protect this family that had somehow become hers. "There's an us," she said softly. "I don't know exactly what kind yet, and I'm terrified of getting it wrong, but yes, this is real for me too." Jacob released a breath like he'd been holding it for weeks. Then slowly, carefully, he leaned forward and kissed her. Not the perfunctory wedding kiss that had been for show, but something real and deep and full of promise. When they finally pulled apart, Eleanor was shaking.
We should probably take this slow, she managed. Probably, Jacob agreed, though he didn't let go of her hand. We've got time. All the time we need to figure out what we're doing.
They sat together until late, talking about everything and nothing, and when Eleanor finally went to her own room, because slow meant slow, even when every part of her wanted to follow Jacob to his, she lay awake feeling more settled and more hopeful than she had since boarding that train to Montana so many weeks ago. The house was finished by late August, and the community threw a celebration that felt more like a wedding reception than a construction completion party. Tables groaned under contributed food, fiddles appeared from somewhere, and even the most taciturn ranchers unbent enough to dance under the stars. Eleanor found herself swept into conversation after conversation with women who wanted to talk about the school, men who wanted to thank her for standing up to Tom Miller, children who were excited about the prospect of real education. She was dizzy with it, overwhelmed but in the best possible way. "You did this," Jacob said, appearing at her elbow with 2 cups of punch. "Built something from nothing, created community where there was just survival before." "We did this," Eleanor corrected. "All of us together." Miles and Ethan raced past chasing other children, their laughter bright and clear in the evening air. Eleanor watched them go, her throat tight with emotion. "They smiled today," she said. "Both of them. Real, genuine smiles." "I know," Jacob said. "I saw." His voice was thick. 3 years, Eleanor. 3 years of gray faces and silence and nightmares. And you gave them back their childhood in less than 2 months. "It wasn't just me. It was exactly you," Jacob interrupted. "Your stubbornness, your courage, your refusal to give up on us even when giving up would have been easier. You saved us, Eleanor, all 3 of us." Before Eleanor could respond, Martha appeared with Sue and 2 other women, all of them carrying something wrapped in cloth. "We made you something," Martha announced, "for the school." They unwrapped it to reveal a wooden sign, beautifully carved and painted. "Reed School, Esternt, 1882. "It's perfect," Eleanor breathed, running her fingers over the lettering. "When did you find time to make this?" "We've all been working on pieces," Sue explained. "The school's important, Eleanor. You're giving these children something most of them would never have access to. We wanted you to know how much that means." Eleanor felt tears threatening and blinked them back fiercely. "I don't know what to say." "Say you'll start with the fall term," Martha suggested. "We've already got 12 families confirmed who want to send their children. More if you've got room." "I'll make room," Eleanor promised. The school opened on the first Monday in September with 15 students ranging from 6 to 14 years old. Eleanor had converted one of the new house's larger rooms into a classroom, and Jacob had built desks and benches from salvaged lumber. The supplies were mismatched: slates donated by various families, books from Eleanor's own collection supplemented by donations from the community, but it was enough to start. Miles and Ethan sat in the front row, helping the younger children and demonstrating that yes, learning could actually be enjoyable. Eleanor taught reading in the morning, mathematics in the afternoon, and filled the spaces between with history and geography and science learned from the natural world around them. It was exhausting and exhilarating and exactly what Eleanor had been meant to do with her life. She understood that now. All the struggle in Boston, all the rejection and judgment and feeling like she didn't fit, it had been leading her here, to this rough schoolroom on a Montana ranch where children who would otherwise grow up illiterate learned to read Shakespeare and calculate geometric proofs. Jacob watched from the doorway sometimes during lessons, his expression soft with something that looked like wonder. And at night, after the students had gone home and the boys were in bed, he and Eleanor would sit together and talk about the day's successes and challenges, their relationship deepening with every conversation. They still maintained separate rooms. Slow was slow, but the wall between them was growing thinner by the day. October brought the first real test of the school when a late storm rolled through, dumping 6 inches of snow overnight and making the roads nearly impassable. Several families sent word their children couldn't make the journey, but 5 hardy souls showed up anyway, determined not to miss lessons. Eleanor taught those 5 with the same dedication she gave 15, and when the storm worsened and it became clear the children couldn't safely go home, she and Jacob converted the main room into a temporary dormitory. The children bedded down near the fireplace while Eleanor and Jacob took turns keeping watch, making sure the fire didn't die and no one got scared. Around midnight, one of the younger girls, a 6-year-old named Anna, woke crying for her mother. Eleanor soothed her with the same techniques she'd used on Ethan's nightmares, telling stories until the child drifted back to sleep. "You're good at this," Jacob observed quietly from his position by the fire. "Being a mother." "I'm learning," Eleanor said, "mostly from watching you be a father." Jacob smiled. "We make a good team." "We do," Eleanor agreed. They looked at each other across the dim room full of sleeping children, and Eleanor felt something click into place. This was family. Not the family she'd planned when she boarded that train to marry James Calloway, but something richer and stranger and infinitely more real. "I love you," she said, the words emerging before she could think better of them. "I don't know when it happened exactly, but it did." "I love you, Jacob Reed." Jacob went very still. Then he stood and crossed to where Eleanor sat, pulling her to her feet and into his arms. "I love you too," he said against her hair. "Have for weeks now, but I was afraid to say it. Afraid you'd feel pressured or trapped or—" Eleanor kissed him, cutting off the worry with action. When they finally broke apart, both breathless, she smiled. "I'm not trapped. I'm exactly where I choose to be." They spent that night talking in whispers while the storm raged outside and the children slept safe and warm. They talked about the future, about expanding the school, about maybe having children of their own someday, about the life they were building together from the ruins of their separate pasts. When dawn broke and the storm cleared, the children's families came to collect them, and word spread through the community about how the Reeds had kept everyone safe through the night. More families signed up for the school. More trust was built. More roots grew deeper. November brought the telegram Eleanor had been half expecting and half dreading. James Calloway's lawyer had officially withdrawn the contract claim, citing insufficient grounds for prosecution. Tom Miller had left the territory entirely. Rumor said he'd gone to California to try his luck in the gold fields. The shadow that had hung over Eleanor's marriage lifted completely. "It's really over," she told Jacob that evening. "No more legal threats, no more Tom, no more past chasing me." "Just the future ahead," Jacob said. "Whatever we make of it." That night, Eleanor didn't go to her own room. By unspoken agreement, she followed Jacob to his, and they finally consummated the marriage that had been real in every way but this for months. It was tender and awkward and perfect, two people who'd found each other by accident learning how to fit together on purpose. Afterward, lying in Jacob's arms while he traced lazy patterns on her shoulder, Eleanor felt peace settle over her like a blanket. "No regrets?" Jacob asked quietly. "Not a single one." Winter came hard and fast that year, but the Reed house was warm and solid against the cold. Eleanor taught through December, though student attendance dropped as families hunkered down on isolated ranches. She used the time to plan curriculum for spring and to help the boys with advanced studies that would prepare them for whatever future they chose. And at night, she and Jacob learned each other in the way married couples do, building intimacy through shared warmth and whispered conversations and the simple comfort of not being alone. By January, Eleanor knew she was pregnant. She told Jacob on a night when the stars were so bright and clear they looked close enough to touch, and his joy was so pure and complete that she cried. "Another child," he said wonderingly, his hand splayed across her still flat stomach. "A new beginning." "Are you disappointed it's not a boy?" Eleanor teased, "to even out the numbers?" "I don't care if it's a boy or a girl or a chorus of both," Jacob said. "It's ours. That's all that matters." They told the boys the next morning, and Miles and Ethan's reaction sealed the final healing of their family. They were excited rather than threatened, asking questions about when the baby would come and whether it would like the same stories Eleanor told them, and could they teach it to ride horses when it was big enough. "You're not trying to replace our mama," Ethan said seriously. You're our mama too, the one who didn't leave. The one who stayed even when things were hard." Eleanor gathered both boys into a fierce hug, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. Spring arrived with a rush of green and wildflowers, and with it came the expansion of the school. 22 students now, with 3 more families planning to enroll their children in the fall. Eleanor taught through her pregnancy with the same determination she applied to everything, finally conceding to afternoon rest only when Jacob insisted. "You're carrying my child," he said firmly. "Our child. You're allowed to slow down."
"I'll rest when this baby's born," Eleanor countered, but she did start taking breaks, using the time to prepare a nursery in one of the house's small rooms. The baby, a girl they named Sarah Hope Reed, arrived on a blazing summer afternoon with the same dramatic timing her mother had shown arriving in Montana. Eleanor labored through the heat with Martha and 2 other ranch women attending her, and when she finally held her daughter in her arms and saw Jacob's face as he looked at both of them, she understood that this was what she'd traveled 2,000 miles to find. Not a convenient marriage or a teaching position or escape from her past, but family. Real, complicated, beautiful family born from fire and struggle and the stubborn refusal to give up. Miles and Ethan were entranced by their baby sister. They took turns holding her with careful solemnity, making promises about teaching her everything they knew and protecting her from anything that might hurt her. Eleanor watched them with hope in her arms and Jacob's hand on her shoulder, and felt so full of love she thought she might burst with it. "Still no regrets?" Jacob asked quietly, echoing that long-ago question. Eleanor looked around the room, at her sons, her daughter, her husband, the home they'd built together, literally and figuratively. She thought about the Eleanor who'd stepped off the train in Copper Ridge over a year ago, desperate and alone and heartbroken. That woman was gone, replaced by someone stronger and surer and infinitely happier. "Not a single one," she said. "This is exactly where I'm supposed to be." The years that followed were not without challenges. There were hard winters and difficult harvests, sick children and anxious nights. But there was also growth. The school expanded until Eleanor had to hire an assistant teacher. The ranch prospered. Miles and Ethan grew into fine young men who credited their mother, both their mothers, with making them who they became. And Eleanor and Jacob built a marriage that was genuine partnership, founded on respect and trust, and a love that had grown from the ashes of their separate losses into something neither could have imagined alone. On their 5th anniversary, Jacob gave Eleanor a gift, a new sign for the school that read Reed Community School, with a subtitle, Founded by Eleanor Reed, 1882. "You built this," he said. "You took a desperate situation and turned it into opportunity. For yourself, for our family, for this whole community. I wanted to make sure everyone remembers that." Eleanor hung the sign herself, with Miles and Ethan helping and little Hope watching from Jacob's arms. She looked at the building that had started as one room in their house and had grown into a proper schoolhouse, educating over 40 children. She looked at her family, healthy and whole, and hers in every way that mattered. And she thought about that moment in the Copper Ridge saloon when Jacob had said, "Come with me," and she'd made the choice to trust a stranger. Best decision she'd ever made. Years later, when her own granddaughter asked her to tell the story of how she came to Montana, Eleanor would smile and begin, "I was supposed to marry a man who didn't want me, in a town that didn't care if I lived or died. But then a rancher with sad eyes and 2 silent boys told me I didn't belong there. And he was right. I belonged here, with them, building a life from nothing and turning it into everything." The granddaughter would ask if she was scared, and Eleanor would be honest. Terrified. Every single day at first. But fear is just a thing you carry, sweetheart. It doesn't have to stop you from moving forward. It didn't stop me. She'd tell about the fires and the nightmares and the legal battles and the hard work of building both a house and a family. She'd talk about Jacob's quiet strength and the boys' gradual healing and the community that rallied around them when they needed it most. And she'd end with the same words she'd said to Jacob on that first real conversation about their marriage. "One step at a time. That's how you survive impossible things. One step, one day, one choice to stay and fight instead of running away." The story of Eleanor Reed became legend in that part of Montana. The bride nobody wanted who became the mother everyone needed, the teacher who brought education to the frontier, the woman who stood her ground when powerful men tried to break her. But for Eleanor herself, the story was simpler. She'd been lost, and she'd been found. She'd been broken, and she'd healed. She'd been alone, and she'd built a family that would span generations. And it had all started with a simple question from a desperate father, "Come with me?"
Eleanor had said yes, and in that yes, she'd found her home.